Hello and welcome to the Breaking Muscle podcast, the show that brings you the top minds in the fitness industry who share their knowledge and experience to help take your training to the next level. I'm your host, Tom McCormick, and today I'm joined by Daniel DeBrocke. He is a strength and conditioning coach who primarily works with powerlifters. As a competitive powerlifter himself, he holds a 1,700-pound raw total. In this episode, we discuss how he took himself from 165 to 286 pounds, how beginners can gain muscle most efficiently, how advanced lifters should sequence their training for optimal progress, pivot blocks, strategic variation, developing work capacity, and a whole lot more. So, without further delay, it's on with the podcast. All right, guys, as I said in that intro, which I just messed up, I'm delighted to be joined today by Daniel, who's a huge guy, incredibly strong, loads of knowledge and written some really good articles lately. And we're going to try and go a little bit deeper in particularly powerlifting programming and then the role of hypertrophy within success with powerlifting. And hopefully some great tips there for the average lifter, the competitive powerlifter, and also the sort of guys that I often coach, the naturally skinny guy. Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. It's been a really cool experience. Writing for you guys. I've been following your stuff for the last little bit, and that's actually kind of how we got connected. So it's really cool to be on the podcast, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm really excited to have you on chatting about some of the stuff today. Can you give us a little bit of background about your journey into fitness, how you got started, and how you've progressed to the point you are now?
Yeah, so I actually I started up. I'd say my intro to athletics was I was a competitive boxer and Muay Thai fighter for about 8 years. And I was really, really skinny at that time just because that's kind of the frame that works pretty well. And once I decided that I was retiring from fighting, I just got bored. I was like, because my whole life was dedicated to sports. So I'd go in the morning, train for 3 hours, go to work, go back, train for another 3 hours, and then go home, right? Because I competed at a relatively high level. And then once I was done, then I was like, I didn't know what to do with my time. So I was like, well, I may as well just try weightlifting. And so I actually started at an Olympic weightlifting facility. I was very, very fortunate because the head coach was actually the head Olympic coach for the Russian national team for like 20 years. So he trained like David Rieger, Alexei Vasiliev, and all those like crazy guys. And so it was very, very fortunate. And that was my first experience with like barbells and free weights and any of that stuff. So I did that for several years. And then I sustained a really serious back injury, and that kind of stopped me from being able to do any high velocity based movements. So that's actually how I got my introduction into powerlifting, was because I was like, well, I need to do something. So I started lifting weights, but like I said, the speed, the ballistic movements were too much for my injury. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of where I am right now. I just fell in love with it. And I think I've been lifting weights for probably about 8 years now. So about 4 years weightlifting and 4 years powerlifting.
Okay, so you had a pretty good athletic background, obviously, from the boxing, the Muay Thai. The time you spent training, so you were used to training like 3 hours a day, or was it maybe multiple times per day? And then did you find that you needed something to fill that gap and something to be competitive, or just something to occupy your time? When you started lifting, were you already thinking, I'm going to compete in this, or were you just thinking this is a positive endeavor to follow?
Kind of both. Like I'd say I was definitely a bit naive. Like I went in there, 165-pound guy at 6 foot tall, being like, oh, I'm going to be the national champion. No problem. Because like I excelled very, very rapidly in boxing and Muay Thai. But I think mostly because it's such a high skill sport, and I don't want to say there's not a big physical component, because there is, but regardless of how fit you are, it's far more skill based than it is anything else. Whereas weightlifting and powerlifting are strength based sports. So if you don't have the actual physical attributes, then you're screwed, right? So I kind of went in there a little bit naive, thinking that I was just going to be a rock star at it, and I absolutely was not. I was incredibly weak, and some of the women were outlifting me and stuff like that. But it was a good experience because, like, one, it was humbling, and two, it just taught me a lot about how long some of these things really take, And it's actually how I became a coach myself, because one of my training partners ran a big box gym, and he's like, hey, you should become a personal trainer. So it's actually how I got my introduction to coaching as well. So that was kind of a cool little start for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, you said you were 165 pounds when you started lifting, and how much are you now?
I weighed in today at 286.4 pounds.
Yeah.
So a little heavier.
Some gains have been made.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so yeah, that's a pretty substantial. Not quite doubled in size, but nearly
Yeah,
there. Is there with that is weight something that you on your weight on the scales that you obviously you monitor it, you weighed in today, that you're frequently checking? Is that a goal in and of itself? Have you got a weight that you're chasing, or does it naturally it's gone up just because you've been eating and training hard?
I'd say initially when I first started, I ended up gaining like 30 pounds in the first 2 years of training. And I honestly had no idea, because the changes kind of happened slowly, like I said, over 2 years. And I didn't even know until my coach had told me, like, hey, you've actually gone up a couple of weight classes. And so that was, I think initially it was just kind of like a byproduct of all the training and the extra eating and things like that. But then I think once I got a little bit more serious into powerlifting and started setting some relatively ambitious goals, that's when I really started looking at my body weight and saying, okay, if I really want to do this, I probably have to get up to about 360, 370 eventually. So right now I want to maintain my body weight where it's at, get as strong as I can, because then extra body weight for me is just that kind of ace in my back pocket, right? Where I can kind of capitalize on that increased cross-sectional area, and then strength goes up as well. So
absolutely interesting you say about how you gain those first 30 pounds without realizing. I think it shows how the phenomenon of the newbie gains, almost as long as you're not doing something completely stupid and starving yourself, when you start lifting, there's those first 20, 30, maybe even 40 pounds are pretty easy to come by, and then it's it's obviously a lot harder to keep that progress going and gain like over 100 pounds. But something for people to realize. If someone's listening to this and they've been training 6 months, if the scale hasn't sort of jumped up a bit already, they're probably doing something wrong, whether it be training or nutrition wise.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I think I had a little bit of a kind of a technical advantage, because going from boxing and like I said, I was training like 6 hours a day and doing that 6 or 7 days a week for years and years and years. So the amount of food that I was consuming just to stay at 165 pounds was actually insane. I actually ate more then than I do now, to be honest, because my expenditure was so high, or at least it was pretty darn close. Going from that and then just having my usual eating habits, I don't think that my eating habits changed a ton when I changed over. And so I think that helped a lot, because I was already used to eating that much, but now I just wasn't burning as much energy. So I was able to kind of turn some of that energy into some, lean tissue. So that was pretty good.
Yeah. So you created a relative calorie surplus without actually having to eat more, just because activity levels were down. So there's two things you've said so far. You said about the skill-based element of your previous, boxing, etc., the background, and also the amount of training you're doing. So there's two things that have sprung to mind with me there, which is that you have a focus and an attention to detail, which from some of your posts and stuff on Instagram, your technique, you can see you've transferred that over to your lifting. The technique and skill element of powerlifting is still there, perhaps not quite to the same degree as you say some other sports, but it can give you that little edge to keep the numbers going up. And also, how significant do you think it was when you came into this kind of training that you had that huge work capacity? You can probably handle more volume than the average powerlifter could, because of that athletic background you had.
I'm not sure if my work capacity would have been better from like a specificity standpoint, just because the work that I was doing before was so cardiovascularly heavy that it ended up being different. And not to mention, like, I think for Olympic weightlifting too, there's a big learning curve, right? Because so much, at least for me, in the initial stages of Olympic weightlifting, was skill acquisition. So when you're acquiring these new skills, you're not going to be lifting anywhere near your one repetition max or anything like that. You're probably not even going to be lifting at 70 or 80% or even 60%. So a lot of the skill acquisition kind of occurred at like 40, 50% initially, just building up a technical base. And then probably after several months is when I started going up again, and slowly increasing in volume. So I don't know that it helped that much, but I guess what I will say is, like, from my perspective on training and work capacity and the value of doing training, that increases your work capacity, definitely carried over. But I don't know if my actual work capacity from boxing or Muay Thai translated into better performance on the platform.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wonder how long that kind of capacity hangs around for. But also, it seems to me that at first you were basically just doing skill-based training with zero actual physical fatigue being, or close to zero, because it just would be so, so low in terms of overall training volume to what you were used to, and such, a skill focus. You're almost that window of opportunity was huge, because you weren't beating yourself down. There was no real recovery or fatigue management required, because it was in that respect very easy. And I wonder if that sort of created this runway for you then, once the technique was dialed in, that you then could push and accelerate your learning curve compared to the average guy. We'll never know unless we can clone you and get a comparison there. But I thought that was an interesting possibility. Another thing you mentioned was it takes time. So for you to get as strong as you are now, it's taken time. You said you got some goals. You realise your weight's going to have to go up to reach that. How important is it for you, or for new lifters, to realise that they're not going to get jacked in the next 3 weeks like Men's Health tells them or something, that they're in this for the long haul, and to manage their expectations a little bit?
I honestly think that's probably one of the most fundamental things that you need to do with your athletes, and you need to do with yourself, right? Like, being honest about where you're at and really having a good understanding about the process, what it actually looks like, is critically important, because I think any experienced athlete has gone through that, where they've wanted to rush goals. And 9 times out of 10 in my experience, what that usually leads to is improper load management. So doing way too much volume, way too much intensity, and then you just burn out, potentially get injured, and you just go through this cycle, right? And so I think that for me anyways, when I started being a lot more patient with my results and saying, you know what, it'll happen when it happens. Let me just listen to my body, and whatever I'm capable of today, then that's fine. So long as I can keep stacking on one good training session after another, I know that eventually I'll get there. It gave me a little bit more of like an immediate goal to tackle, because let's say, for instance, you're brand new to the gym and you can squat like 100 pounds, and your goal is to squat 300 pounds, let's say. That's a pretty long ways away. Now, it might not be a long ways away, but you have no idea of determining how long it takes for your body to adapt. And so if you don't have these kind of intermediary milestones along the way, it's really hard to stay focused, to stay motivated. Whereas if you can dial in like, hey, am I having good training sessions? This week, did I hit like a rep PR? And you can kind of look for those wins. Even like, hey, did my technique look a little bit better? The more that I think you can focus on those type of things and focus a little bit less on long-term outcomes, those long-term outcomes just kind of solve themselves, because you keep stacking on good training session after good training session. And I think your mentality to training is much better because it's more long-term focused. I always tell people, I'm like, hey, if I came to, like, they'll come to me and they'll be like, hey, I want to put on this much muscle in this amount of time. And I'm like, okay, great. Well, one, how'd you come up with that much muscle, and how'd you come up with that timeline? Like, what's this based off of? And always it's an arbitrary assignment based on convenience, essentially. It's like, well, it would be super convenient if I could just put on 500 pounds on my squat and gain 20 pounds of lean mass and just be super jacked by, Christmas. It's like, well, yeah, but if I were to come to you and say, hey, I want to be a millionaire, and then you ask me the details of my plan, and I say, well, I don't really have a plan, I'm just going to do it. You'd be like, that's ridiculous. And I think sometimes it's how we approach things. And so when you have I think the right education is really important, because if you don't know how long it takes to synthesize new muscle, you can't really appreciate how long it actually takes. Like, I hear guys being like, oh yeah, I put on 10 pounds in a month. And I'm like, sure you did. You put on 10 pounds of fat and water weight, and like maybe, 0.75 pounds of actual lean tissue, lean mass. So I think it's really, really important to understand those things. And I think that there's probably no better place to get that than finding like some sort of mentor or coach or something along those lines to kind of guide you and help you avoid some of those mistakes that we all make, because I definitely made those for several years. So
I think there's a couple of things there. So focusing on the process, is a vital element for anyone's adherence long term. I think being more process focused and outcome focused is really crucial. Yeah. And then probably marrying the two. You almost want to have that long term vision. You know where you want to go, and as you say, you break it down into the process goals along the way, and you just tick those off. The big goal takes care of itself. So that's a vital tip. And then interesting you say about the whole packing on 10 pounds this month or whatever. I think one thing that's been obvious from the questions I get is rates of gain and what's realistic, and giving some people, because people have absolutely no idea. Like you say, some people are like, well, I'm going to gain 5 pounds a week, and that's going to be great, and I'm going to be like Arnold in 2 months time. So having some guidelines and things, and some actual slightly more useful articles that, shall we say, out there compared to some of the crazy headlines you see, it is absolutely essential. So we've talked about your athletic background, how you transitioned through from boxing and then worked your way through Olympic lifting and powerlifting, and that's one way, finding this journey. Now, just to sort of we'll go with best case, if you had a 16-year-old kid and you wanted them to get to the top, in powerlifting, how would you, if again, starting off with anything's available, we'll fine tune it and maybe put some caveats on to give us some context, but just a broad outline, how does someone get as strong as possible in the power lifts, over the course of, say, a decade?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. This is something I've actually thought about a lot because I've been a little bit more interested in youth athletic development as of late. I think one of the most important things to do with youths is just developing general athletic abilities. So, for instance, in Zatsiorsky's textbook, one of the things he recommends for youth athletes is just general physical activity. So not just doing powerlifting or weightlifting is more so what he was focusing on, but like having them play rugby, soccer, football, basketball, where you're actually developing all of these different general skill sets. I don't know if those general skill sets have necessarily a high translation into your sport performance for powerlifting, but what I do believe that those things kind of lay down some of the fundamentals of just body awareness, kinesthetic awareness, your ability to move, your ability to learn different and more complex movements and adapt them. And I also think that the general strength that you develop from doing like gymnastics and a lot of those things can have a pretty high translation down the road into strength performance. So I would definitely start there, get them to do more general stuff, just get them generally athletic, and probably simultaneously work on some sort of movement pattern, just with like a barbell, not go too crazy, and really, really take my time in terms of loading. So there's quite a bit of research on how to effectively train novice lifters and youth athletes as well. And so, I mean, there's substantial research showing pretty significant gains in both hypertrophy and neural adaptations from like training at a rate of 45 to 50% of 1RM and utilizing a higher rep range. So somewhere in like the 8 to 12 rep range. So they get more exposures to the actual repetition and the technical proficiency as well. And then because they're in such far proximity to failure, they don't have to worry about any of these like just straining and grinding or anything like that. So they can really become proficient and familiar with all the different aspects and complexities of, each lift and what's required. And then I probably build them on a training frequency of about 3 times per week, eventually maybe moving to 4 times per week, probably about 4 to 6 exercises for 2 to 4 sets per exercise. Again, nowhere in close proximity to failure. I'm talking about like 10 repetitions in reserve kind of thing. And then doing that for several months until they kind of build up a little bit more of a tolerance, their work capacity goes up. And then at that point, slowly and gradually increasing their loading, eventually taking very generalized training program and creating a little bit more specialized programs. But I think that whole process would honestly take probably 1 to 2 years. Just going. And then they'd kind of start their real bulk of training where it's like, now we actually have a little bit more of a periodized approach and things like that.
Absolutely. Okay, interesting. So, yeah, I completely agree. I think that developing that kind of broad base from having different sports or physical activities. I think it's Ilian once had, like, they talked about his training when he was 16. It was all, just like some kind of circuit of random, what seemed fairly random exercises, but it was this whole point, as you say, about GPP in some respects, but just kinesthetic awareness, getting their body moving through space, and then that stands them in good stead. And then I think another thing is that early specialization seems to be an issue. It probably didn't used to be an issue in things like powerlifting, but now powerlifting's a lot more popular. CrossFit's made Olympic lifting a lot more popular, and now you see youngsters almost trying to specialize in that early. Now, if they're in some Chinese training camp, maybe that can end up being very successful, but there'll be a pretty high attrition rate. For the average kid, I think that's a danger. They start seeing that, and obviously this is a slightly different topic or a bit of a tangent, but with Instagram, and they see guys with hitting their PRs, there's these impressionable kids who start chasing weight before they've got the technique in place, and then that's just more likely to lead to injury. So as you say, I think that that broad base of different physical activities really helps prevent against that. And then starting out in a slow, methodical approach that you outlined is a great idea. Obviously, one thing that's difficult with youngsters is they're keen to have it now, and how do we go about managing them not getting ahead of themselves and trying to push too hard when probably, as you say, they can be far from failure, training relatively infrequently and just building a base by doing the basics exceptionally well. How do we go about the psychology of not letting them get ahead of themselves?
I think two things are really critical. The first I'd say is tracking metrics. If you're tracking metrics, you have clear, tangible data on, hey, here's where you were, here's where you are right now. And that can be very motivating because results are really motivating, And I think the second thing too is just having a conversation about them and being like, hey, what do you want to accomplish? Sometimes it can be a little challenging if you're talking to a youth because you're like, hey, what do you want in 10 years? And they're like, I don't know, I want a pony. But
I still want one now. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly, right. But simultaneously, I think if you can open up that dialogue and kind of get them to think a little bit more long-term, like, hey, what do you think is going to happen? And then I find education through asking questions is really effective. So, I mean, if we're talking and you're like, well, I want to get stronger, and I'm like, and I want to, lift heavier weights because that's going to make me stronger. I can come and I can be like, okay, well, actually, that's not true because blah, blah, blah. But now we're in confrontation, right? Whereas if I were to be like, oh, okay, great. So why do you think lifting 90+% 2 or times more frequently per week is going to get you stronger? You're like, oh, well, because of this. And then I'm like, okay, well, why is that going to be beneficial? Why is that? And eventually I'll exhaust your rationale and you're like, yeah, I don't even know. And I'm like, okay, great. And then I'll kind of come in and fill in the gaps. So I'll be like, look, yes, lifting maximally will help. Like if you want to get maximally strong, lifting your 1RM is going to get you maximally strong. But how frequently can you do that? It's an opportunity cost, right? And so kind of explaining things in a little bit more of a big picture stance. But I think tracking metrics and then having the dialogue and coming from a place of like where you're really questioning them, getting them to think about things. And then once you can kind of identify those gaps in their knowledge and their education, and be like, okay, well, here's where we need to fill in some of the blanks. Does that make sense? And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that does. And that usually gets a little bit more buy-in from the athlete. And then in addition to that, I'd also say changing the goalpost a little bit. So if our goal is, hey, snatch or if we're talking about powerlifting for youth and we're saying, okay, your goal is going to be to deadlift 400 pounds, that's their goal. Whereas if I say, hey, your goal is to do this deadlift without hitching, it's to do this, it's to do that. I want you to hit this number by this week. And if you're doing that, that means we're making really good progress. We can kind of start to change those goalposts a little bit and have different conversations with our athletes to put their attention on something that's a little bit more productive, like I said, increasing technical proficiency and the value of that over time, right? Because obviously as you get better, that's when it's really going to matter. Like you can have horrendous technique at like 65%. It's not really going to matter that much. It's still going to be a great workout. You're still going to get a huge stimulus, but you try having horrendous technique at 95, 100%, and you're just going to fail the lift as well, right? So I think kind of changing the goalpost, setting up specific targets for them to kind of look forward to and give them those little wins like, wow, look, here's your video of you squatting a month ago. Here's your video of you squatting now. You see how your hips aren't shifting very much in the bottom. Like you did a really great job of this. And so giving them those little wins along the way, I think is really important. So I'd say those are probably the three biggest things that I would tend to focus on.
Yeah, great. So metrics, having that good two-way dialogue, and then I suppose not clashing with them, taking on board their points, and then using a questioning approach to sort of guide them to some maybe better choices. And then, changing the goalposts. I like that. And giving them the little wins with whatever that be, but to keep their momentum and their motivation up, but maybe not just getting them get hyper focused on the weight on the bar will definitely be valuable. And one other thing I was going to say, thinking of some of the guys I've worked with, they like the feeling of like exhaustion. They're stimulus junkies. So I found that almost programming a low skill exercise at the end that they can just blast themselves, something like, okay, you're going to finish with some prowler pushes, some sled drags, or you can do bicep curls, 2 sets to failure, just so they walk out and they feel like they've really done some work, but it hasn't really interfered overall. Some kind of strategies like that I've found has been pretty useful as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like I was actually talking to someone on Instagram hit me up and they're like, hey, I saw one of your athletes doing bicep curls. Why are they doing bicep curls for powerlifting? And I was like, because she likes bicep curls. like that's my answer. And I mean, sometimes there's not like, oh, this is going to increase this, which is going to have a higher transference. And it's like, an athlete has to enjoy what they're doing, or else they're going to lose buy-in, they're going to lose interest, intrinsic motivation is going down. So yeah, that's a really great point. I totally forgot to mention that. Actually, one additional thing that I wanted to mention about youth development of athletics is there's a fair bit of research on, I guess, like the psychological component of coaching youth and more experienced athletes. And where more experienced athletes tend to actually prefer more constructive criticism, like just more blunt, direct constructive criticism to help them improve. Youth athletes actually tend to need a lot more encouragement, a lot more guidance, a lot more support, so that they can actually build up their confidence. And so that was another thing that I think is really important as well for the guidance that I just thought I'd mention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way you deliver feedback and the language you use is going to be vital. Obviously, it's person dependent, but of course, in those age brackets, they're going to be slightly different stages of their psychological development. So that's a really, really good point. So let's move things on now. So we've got an experienced lifter. Well, in fact, maybe we'll reverse engineer it. If you describe how your current training looks, that'll give people an insight into what you're doing, and then maybe we'll work back from there. So it's important for people, I think, to understand that someone who's basically twice as strong as them, for example, they don't necessarily need to be following their program now. They maybe need to be asking, well, what was that guy doing 5-6 years ago, and what lessons can I learn there? So we'll maybe bridge that gap. But can you give us an insight into how you're currently training and how that looks?
Yeah, I'd say I honestly think that my training is pretty unconventional. I tend to put a very large emphasis on high volume and technical proficiency. So, for instance, like I just finished a volume block 2 weeks ago, and like in the volume block, each workout is a really high density of volume. So, for instance, on one day I'm doing 6 sets of 10 squats with a safety bar, and then I did 6 sets of 8 on incline press, and then 4x8 Romanian deadlifts, and then 6 sets of 10 lat pull downs. And then I also, during my volume blocks, I time my rest periods for everything. I don't just chill. I think that's really important for improving work capacity and also for kind of gauging where you're at, because a lot of the times guys are taking 10, 15 minutes rest between, and I'm like, dude, what are you going to do when you get to a meet? Yeah. Like if this is how you're training and you get to a meet and you've only got 5 minutes, then you're screwed. Whereas if I'm used to training with 3 minutes on squats, and then when it gets really heavy, I go up to like 5 minutes. Well, when I have 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to smoke it, Now I can see both perspectives where it's like, well, maybe you could get a little bit more out of your training if you took longer rest, but this is something that works for me and it kind of fits into the bigger picture. But I start off with a pretty simplistic approach. So I have a really high volume block of training, and then I move into a strength block and then a peaking block. I tend to focus a lot on submaximal lifting with a pretty linear progression of weights. So I'll start in my volume block as low as like 55%, increase by 5% every week, and I finish at 75% on my last week. Then I have like kind of a pivot block, so I don't really take deloads. I think that just naturally the deloads kind of happen on their own when you transition from a higher volume to lower volume, higher intensity training program. So I don't typically have deloads. When I run my strength block, it ends up being the same thing, typically higher volume, starting at like 60% and then going all the way up to 85%. And then my peaking block is also, I'd say, pretty unconventional, starting with pretty high volumes. And the only time I touch 90% is 1 week out from comp, which again, for someone my size, seems to be pretty short taper.
Right.
And yeah, I only really touch heavy weights one time out of a 16-week training cycle, which I would say is pretty unconventional. But it's worked very, very well for me. It's worked very well for a lot of my athletes, although I don't do that with several of my athletes. But yeah, so it's kind of how my training has been going now.
Okay, so I suppose the thing is, for you, an experienced lifter who kind of has a good gauge of what their numbers are and what their likely realistic progression from one comp to the next is, that not touching 90% until 1 week before is something you can deal with psychologically and physiologically. That you know that you're going to get a good response. Someone who's less experienced, obviously, they may be better for them to push a little bit closer, just because they have no idea what their actual max is. So they're basically working off a mythical number almost, like as you, they're probably guessing it's going to be up here, and actually they're more likely here, but whatever. And so I suppose less experienced it may be, then they couldn't do things exactly as you do, which makes sense. But couple of things. So essentially a fairly linear progression, which for powerlifting makes perfect sense, it seems to me. Obviously, I don't know what your thoughts are on something like conjugate or something, but for say like a raw lifter and that's going to compete in powerlifting, it seems that linear progression is basically tailor-made for them to display their best performance, right? You'd agree?
I do tend to agree. Most of the really effective training programs I've seen and coaches I've talked to don't do a lot of undulation. I mean, you have like someone like Boris Shiko, but I also think he's kind of in a level of his own. So
that's it. I mean, he's writing programs for guys that are going to be, world champions or whatever. And maybe there's different elements there and some nuance, and as you say, and he's probably thinking about a million more things than most people are when they're programming, and he's finding a way to juggle all that. But I just find it kind of amusing. Obviously, Westside seems to have, is almost responsible for the popularity of that conjugate. But with all the equipped lifters, that may well be a fantastic approach. Obviously, it's been incredibly successful, so you can't doubt that. But with now the popularity of raw lifting, trying to take that, I'm not an experienced powerlifter, but it seems like they are, by and large, almost two different sports. And you wouldn't train a rugby player the same as you would a soccer player, and to some extent the similarities are about equivalent with the difference between the equipped lifters.
There's definitely a pretty big difference. It's actually interesting because with Louis Simmons and Westside, for the longest time I hated it, and I was like, this is nonsense. But he does have some phenomenal athletes, and I was like, you don't get that kind of notoriety for knowing nothing. So I read all of his books. I read all of his book recommendations. I listened to his podcasts and did all this stuff for about 2 years because I was determined to find out where the gems were. I kind of came to the conclusion, pretty similar to you, that most of that stuff doesn't work for raw lifters, but I also came away with a lot of really, really great insights from how he approaches things that I think are really valuable. I don't tend to think that the maximal effort method and the dynamic effort method play a massive role in their strength improvement. I think most of what it is the repetition method that they're doing. They're just doing huge volumes. And I think the max effort method keeps their nervous system primed. So I think it's a combination of those things, but I don't really think speed work. I don't think bands and chains and a lot of that stuff. I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I just think that there's things that we know for certain work. And I think that if you're going to implement bands and chains, it's really got to be in a specific way for a specific athlete to correct a very specific thing. Because it's like, if I prescribe squats to you, like high bar squats, I can prescribe that to like 90% of people and it's going to work pretty well. You know what I mean? I know it's a bit of a broad generalization, but generally speaking, if I program squats in, they're going to get stronger at squatting. Whereas if I program band work in, I might have like 70%, reduction in performance for 70% of my guys, and then an increase in performance for 20% of my guys, or 30%, or whatever it might be. And I've just seen there's so much variability with the effectiveness of some of those protocols that I tend to not use them as much. Not only that, but I just think that like straight weight and like basics work really, really well. So until they stop working, I don't necessarily see a need to exhaust all of the tools in my tool belt. Like, I'd say that how I program is very, very minimalistic and very conservative in the sense that, I look at something and I like to use kind of like an emerging strategies type approach, like Mike Teixeira, where I find something that works and then I just do it over and over and over and over again. And I think that, when people talk about variation in programs, I think they really overestimate how much variation you actually need. Like, for instance, I wouldn't necessarily repeat one block of training. Like, if I do a volume block and it's really productive, I would not repeat that training right away. But if I have a competition cycle where it's like a volume block, a strength block, a peaking block, and I do really well, I will repeat that whole cycle over and over and over and over again. And the variations that I might make are, maybe I'm doing high bar squats in my volume block. Well, maybe the next time I'm going to do it beltless. Like, I honestly think that variations don't need to be that big, and that's enough of a variation to create a novel stimulus and to keep results progressing. And so a lot of the West Side stuff, a lot of the conjugate stuff, I see what they're trying to do, and I think that it can be very beneficial for equipped lifters, but I also think that a lot of it is unnecessary. And I think that the opportunity cost of seeking out a million different exercises doesn't necessarily make it a good risk.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And actually thinking about it, I think probably a better analogy than my rugby and soccer one was actually, well, it's, rugby union and rugby league. Many of the listeners based in North America won't have a clue whether there is a difference between those two, but there is. And there's enough of a similarity that you can take bits from each. And so, for example, there's a lot of transference of coaches and sometimes even players within those two sports. But
right.
They still do a lot of things very different. So that's maybe an example. There are, as you say, there's insight to be taken from Louis Simmons, and he's obviously as an equipped lifter and coach, phenomenal. And take what's useful and ignore the rest. And perhaps whereas before we maybe thought 90% of what he was saying was useful, maybe that percentage is far lower than we thought. But an interesting insight there.
Definitely, there's like this pendulum that kind of goes. It's like, West Side's amazing, West Side's terrible, West Side's amazing. Kind of happens with every like fad or trend or popularized fitness.
Exactly. Yeah, same with your diets and different training protocols. So we'll be back saying bro splits are the best way to train for a bodybuilder soon, and then we'll be back to high frequency and all these things. Yeah, and low, like high carb, low fat will be back very soon, I'm sure. So yeah, these things will happen. We need something to argue about. So interestingly, though, you said about variation. So that was one thing from how you outlined how you transition from that high volume, high density block. Some of the exercises you listed, so it made me think about strategic variation. So one way I think about that is that you use exercise variants further away from meet day. And then as you get closer and closer to the meet, you become more specific in terms of the competition lifts. And you mentioned you do some safety bar squats, some incline pressing, those sort of exercises, certainly in the high volume block. Do you omit the competition lifts, or do you keep the volume quite low on those earlier on and then increase the amount of work you're doing that as you approach a meet? How does that kind of exercise rotation or variation happen?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I do. Like, as the competition nears, specificity increases. So I actually don't do any low bar squatting in my volume block. I only start doing that in my strength block because I need a solid 2 months to really get my technique locked in. But it also gives me a bit of a break, like my shoulders, my elbows, my back a break. And so that's one of the reasons why I do it. I still do the competition bench press, but I just don't pause it in my volume blocks. It's touch and go, but I don't bounce it. So I'm pretty cognizant of that. But I also have a lot more variation. So I bench 4 times a week. So I'll do incline press, like floor press, kind of a competition bench press, but just touch and go. And then, I don't know, I'll have one more bench where maybe like a 2 board or something like that press, right? And then some of that stuff starts to change. So as in my strength block, I remove floor press and in my peaking block, I'll remove floor press and change it to like a three board press. And then I'll go 3 board press, 3 board press, 2 board press, 1 board press as the weeks progress. And so everything kind of starts to get a little bit more specific, but I can also load it a little bit more. So it's kind of the thing that I do. My deadlift's been a little bit tricky, but I think it's because I think I just need a lot more specificity for deadlifts, whereas squats I can get away with a lot more, bench I can get away with a lot more, but for me anyways, just deadlifts. I think I always just need to do straight sumo deadlifts from the floor, kind of always,
Yep. So structurally, would you say that you're a more natural presser than you are a puller in that respect, though? That did squat and bench sort of seem to take off quicker for you, or was deadlift pretty strong as well?
My deadlift is my biggest lift, but I definitely find that squat and bench come a lot more naturally, whereas the deadlift, I'm still kind of trying to find that perfect recipe. You know what I mean? I'm still seeing progress, but I don't feel as comfortable or as confident in my positions. So when I squat and I brace and I go to descend, I'm like super, super tight and I feel really confident. Same thing with bench press. But when I go to pull sumo, it's that initial start position that I kind of struggle to really get into that. And I've been trying to dial that in lately. So I think probably in the next 3 to 4 months here, I'll have it relatively well dialed in. But that's definitely kind of my my thorn for sure.
Yeah. I mean, the deadlift obviously not having that eccentric component is another thing as well. I think it's one of those ones just somehow being able to unrack the weight and then have the eccentric phase allows you to get really, to groove the lift that little bit more. And it gives you a margin for error that's not huge, but if you can almost correct. Whereas you go to pull sumo and you're out of alignment, you're not straight off the bat. Then basically it's not budging, is it? At the at the weights you're handling.
Yeah, exactly.
So interesting. You mentioned you bench or have a bench variation 4 times a week. In terms of frequency, what are we looking at for your squats and your deadlifts? How often are you training variations of those lifts?
This is changing a little bit, but I only squat once a week and deadlift once a week.
Okay.
And that's why I said my training, I think, is very unconventional. Like, I only lift 90% one time out of 16 weeks. I only squat once a week. I only deadlift once a week. I think most people would not do very well with how I lift and how I train, but it ends up working very well for me. So like this competition cycle is the same competition cycle that I did last one. And at the end of my volume block, I have to do a top set of 10 on safety bar squats. And the last comp cycle, I did 405 for 10, and it was like an RP 8 or something like that. Then this time I did 450 for 10 at an RP 8 or 7 as well. And so it's like 45-pound increase for reps. So it's like only squatting once seems to be doing really well.
Yeah.
Every time I try and push it to a higher frequency, I always kind of get burnt out. I added pause squats in at the end. So I do pause squats at the end of my week as well. So I squat in the beginning of the week and I do pause squats in the end. So I just started this strength block. This will be like the 3rd time that I've tried it. I keep trying and failing, but I do think that's the direction I'll eventually go in. I just think sometimes it takes time for your body to fully adapt to all of those things, to be able to manage that kind of additional volume and workload. So I still think it's the right direction. I still think higher frequency is going to give me better results. I just kind of looking for that secret sauce,
Yeah. It's the magic recipe of being able to fit it all together. So if you're squatting on the start of the week, are you squatting on a Monday?
Yeah, my training, so I only train 4 days a week. Mm-hmm. It's a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So I go squat, bench, deadlift, bench. And then I bench every day, but it's squat, bench, deadlift.
Yeah. Okay.
And those
because of course, and you're pulling sumo most of the time. Obviously, there's going to be, I suppose, some residual fatigue from your squat session to your deadlift session to your squat session, back and forth, which maybe affects your ability to squat heavy multiple times. That would make sense to some extent. Also, the other thing. So the other thing is that at the numbers you're lifting, that's very disruptive to the system. Like a guy just starting out squatting 135 pounds probably hasn't got a problem coming back in a few days later and doing that again. Whereas the amount of disruption you're causing when you're, even if, as you say, relative percentage-wise, it's not that high, but still, if you're going 450 for set of 10 on safety bar squats, that still takes its toll.
No, totally. And one thing that I've definitely noticed is if I was pulling conventional, I would definitely have to have a higher squat frequency, because I've noticed that sumo deadlift does, at least for myself, have higher translation into squat and vice versa, just because they're more similar in the sense that they just require a lot more quad strength. But yeah, definitely for smaller athletes, for most athletes, they're squatting that I coach, I think they're squatting at least 2 to 3 times a week. Probably 3 on average, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And deadlifting probably twice a week, and then benching with a really high frequency. And so most people, I think, would do better with, like you're saying, a much higher frequency, at least initially. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is once you've reached a level of strength and experience, then you can start fine-tuning to know exactly what works best for you and individualizing that process. But we want some general guidelines that people can work off. And so those slightly higher frequencies that you outlined are probably going to do great for 75% of people, and that's a good place to go from. And then if they get strong enough to be worrying about where they can find those marginal gains, then that's when the individual differences and tweaking things for them can really pay dividends. So in your high volume block, presumably we're looking at hypertrophy as well in that phase, a bigger muscle being a stronger muscle, and that being an outcome you're looking for. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. The main focus are 2 things, like work capacity, which allows me to train heavier down the road and recover better, so I can have more overloading sessions as a subsequent training continues. And then also, definitely building up certain muscle groups. I tend to believe that most people would benefit from adopting a little bit more of a bodybuilding type approach to their powerlifting. Whereas I think some people tend to have a little bit of an over application of specificity, where they're if it's not squat, bench, or deadlift, it's not worth it. And it's like, okay, well, if you really want to go down that road, then and be most specific, only ever train at a competition, because that's 100% specific. But so it's specificity is more of like a gradient and more of a scale. And so I find that, yes, we need specificity. Yes, we need all these things. But I also think that if you're not training for hypertrophy, you're really missing out on a lot. And I mean, the thing too is for a lot of powerlifters that I see, especially novices coming up and even a lot of intermediates, they're nowhere near filling out their weight class. And I hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, strength is a product of your nervous system. And it's like, well, that's true. But the more contractile tissue you have, the stronger you're going to be. And that's just a fact. So I think a lot of people, especially initially, would have more benefit, especially in the long term, to focus on building up their body first and then focusing more on strength, right? Not necessarily not doing strength, still having a strength focus, but be a little bit more along the lines of like a power building type approach.
Yep.
You definitely have bodybuilding, like more volume-based blocks to build a lot of muscle. And then even in some of your strengths blocks, you still have like, lots of rows or dumbbell presses or whatever it is that you need to develop on your frame to maximize your lifting potential. I think there's a huge lack of that in some instances because people are so focused on specificity. And it's like, I mean, for myself, I know that I'm not going to squat what I want to squat unless I get to about 360.
Yeah. I think that's a good point.
Like, I mean, that's really extreme, I know, but at the same time, plus, I don't think anyone's going to complain about being more jacked. It's like, no, I don't want to put on 20 more pounds and have massive biceps. It's like, well, maybe this isn't the sport for you then.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think, I suppose the other thing is this whole specificity thing, again, maybe comes to looking at what the top in the world are doing now. And so they are training very specifically, but they've got a decade or more of building that overall physique, that muscle mass, that strength, in various lifts, and then really honing in, laser focused on it. And then we're it's like I say to people, if you wanted to play, become better at tennis, you wouldn't necessarily train how Roger Federer does now. If you trained like he did when he was 12, maybe that would stand you in better stead. And again, looking at these elite lifters and what they did at the start of their career, and then in terms of the importance of hypertrophy for it, kind of the analogy that I often use is if you think about a car, like if you've got a bigger engine, you can go faster, and then later down the track, or down the line, if you've got better steering or tracking and these little fine details, that means you can corner better, and that's almost like the displaying the strength on the platform. But you need to build that engine, that horsepower, by getting stronger and packing some size on.
I mean, like that's one thing too that I've noticed, that people tend to major in the minors. Everyone's looking for that quick trick or that new technique, and it's like, man, we already know how to build muscle and get really strong. Like, yeah, there's new research. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yes, it can have application to your training, but 95 or 99% of training has already been figured out, in my opinion, right? Like, we already know it works. We've got guys squatting 1,000 pounds. I think we're doing all right, and I think we need to stop trying to reinvent the wheel sometimes and just be like, look, what do you need to be strong? You need to lift heavy weights, and then building more muscle is going to get you there. And so instead of trying to focus on like myo reps and like all these, not that those things don't work, but yeah, just like checking those fundamental boxes of like, do I have enough muscle mass? Am I filling up my frame? Versus, I need to train like Andrei Milanichev. It's like, well, Andrei Milanichev didn't train like Andrei Milanichev to get to where he is. Like, he's the jacked bodybuilder at 275. And then he just switched and got a little chubby, but got insanely strong. So
I think a lot of people get caught up in protocols, not the principles. And so, you need to focus on the principles. And as long as your training adheres to those basic principles, then progress will take care of itself. And the exact way you go about it and the protocols you use, as you say, people want to do the cool, sexy stuff that is going to get them jacked overnight. But really, the sad reality is the boring stuff done over and over again, the hard stuff done over and over again is what's going to deliver the results.
Absolutely,
yeah. Okay, so we're sort of getting up on time a little bit here. We don't want to take up too much of your time today. So you quickly talked about a pivot block and how you don't really do deloads because you feel that naturally takes care of it. So another way I kind of talk about this, because people don't like the word deload. Also, so, one of these things working with clients is they don't want to take a deload. So one of the ways I tell them it's an intro week. But basically, when something changes in the program, as you alluded to, that kind of naturally takes care of the deload effect, and you get the benefit of dropping some fatigue to then go again. How does a pivot block in practice look for you? So anyone that's listening that's not familiar with that, can you walk us through how that works for you?
Yeah. So, for instance, in the program that I just did, the pivot block. So when I finish my volume block, I finish at about 75%, right? And that's at week 5. And then my pivot block is just a 1-week training block where that drops down to about 60%. And I go from 6 sets of 10 to like maybe 8 sets of 5, again at 60%. So it's a reduction in intensity, it's a reduction in volume, but the exercise changes to the competition style movement, right? So it allows me a little bit of a transition for the different exercise. It reduces volume, it reduces intensity, it allows fatigue to decay a little bit before you kind of go right back into your next block, right? So the next week right after that, I jump up by 10%. So my strength block starts at 70% and then I progress up to 85%. And so I think that naturally just kind of takes care of the recovery requirements for an individual who's a little banged up at the end. But that's kind of how I do it. So usually you'll see a reduction in maybe like 10%, 15% or something like that, and a reduction in volume by like maybe 30%, somewhere along those lines. It's hard for me to give hard and fast rules on this because I think it's so individual specific. And I mean, for myself, it's a lot of my training that I do for myself is a lot more intuitive. So I might have programmed this, but then I'll be like, I'm feeling better. I'm going to push a little bit more. And so 8 sets turns to 12, or, 6 sets turns to 8, or 8 sets turns to 5, so that week is also kind of a feeler block as well to see how I'm feeling, whether or not I should push or kind of dial it back. So there's a little bit more wiggle room in there, I think. And that's just kind of how I approach things.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. Actually, that point you say about how you do things a little bit more intuitively yourself, I think is a vital one. As someone becomes more experienced, or if they have a really good coach or mentor, maybe there's the possibility of having that sort of capacity to auto-regulate. But probably for people earlier on, it's best to have a rigid structure and then go through that and then learn the lessons, because that then allows you to be in a position down the road to then start to auto-regulate and listen to the body a little bit more.
No, 100%. Yeah. I always think that I tend to trust intuition a whole lot more with more education and experience, but that's because it's predicated on education and experience. Yes. It's not, intuition in my mind is not the same as a guess. And so, I mean, it's a very educated guess. And someone might say, oh, I think I'm going to do this. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your rationale? And they're like, I don't know. Whereas I might say, I think I need this. And in some cases, I might not have a very clear rationale for why, but I just know. But I've also got enough training years under my belt to be able to trust that. And same thing with my athletes when they give me this feedback. One of my girls, she just won Worlds at Raw Worlds just recently. And she was like, hey, I think I need to switch my deadlift day from this day to this day. And I was like, cool, let's do it. Oh, yeah. And so it's like, I tend to trust my athletes' intuition, especially at a high level. But then as a beginner, I remember what I was doing as a beginner, and I didn't know anything. And so I think that you can kind of get caught up trying to make all these changes, and you'd be much better, just following a little bit more of a rigid structure in that case.
Yeah. You got to earn the right to be flexible in these things, I suppose. And that's definitely makes sense. So, last little question in terms of general principles: with how often are you competing per year?
Man, it's honestly been terrible the last couple of years. So 2018, I had a very serious back injury. So I was wearing a back brace and I was on crutches for the whole year. So I couldn't compete then. 2019, signed up for a meet, and then I had some other stuff happen, so I couldn't compete then. So I was like, been 2 years without any actual competition, so I'm going a little stir crazy. But my federation just released that they're hosting a competition in March, so I'm signing up for that. I would say for myself, I'd be looking to compete 2, max 3 times a year. I think if you're a novice or someone who's a little less experienced, someone who's a little bit more on the green side, I think competing with a higher frequency would probably be better. Even up to like 4 times, maybe even 5 sometimes, like could be fine. You don't necessarily have to peak for all of them, but I think gaining a lot of competition experience initially is really, really valuable, really important for both directing your training and also just seeing whether or not you even like it. But then ultimately, I think as you get more advanced, that number will kind of go down, and the only competitions that you really, really will peak for are the really important ones. So like I'll peak for nationals and worlds, and then that's it. But I don't care about provincials. I just need to qualify. Even nationals, to be honest, I don't really care. I just need to qualify. And then worlds is really, really the one that I'm going to peak for. But yeah, that's kind of how I do things.
Okay. So with that in mind, if someone's competing twice a year and say that they have like a 16-week prep, for example, that's really focused on that leaves still a reasonable chunk of the year available, and there's going to be some times when you maybe have some active recovery, you have to recover after the comp and take some downtime perhaps, but still there's some weeks in there. If someone's relatively early in their career, would you be in favour of, okay, those periods of time we're really going to focus on hypertrophy, and that's the emphasis, or how are you thinking about filling in those gaps? And also a second point, some people when they're really focused on a meet, their training's great. When they haven't got that meet to focus on, training can be a bit meh. So how again do you go about psychologically keeping them motivated and training hard?
Yeah, so for instance, like with some of my newer athletes, I would get them to do a higher frequency of competition. I would honestly just do the same thing that I do with my more experienced athletes. I tend to not repeat one block at a time, just because I don't want to overuse that pathway, if that makes sense, right? Like I want to maintain the novelty of that stimulus for as long as I can and make as little changes as I can. So I would do, if I found an effective, let's say volume, strength, and peaking block, I would just keep repeating that with the individual, making small adjustments here and there, and we'd find competitions for them to do. And whether or not the competitions fall on, like if we can peak them perfectly for it, great. But if we can't, and maybe they're competitions like in the middle of a volume block, that's fine too. It's just the experience they want to get, and so that's kind of how I approach it. But I do it that way to manage competitions. But usually they line up pretty well so that we can properly peak for at least 3, right? And the other ones, if we're doing more frequent ones than that, then we just do them somewhere in the block, and it's not going to be a huge deal. We just get some good platform experience and kind of call it a day. And then we don't even take any additional days off. We just go right back into training the next day. And that's kind of how I handle that. As far as keeping them motivated, if they don't have a lot of competitions on the horizon, again, I kind of try and move the goalpost. I'm like, okay, what's your long-term goal? Right? Long-term goal, I want to compete at Worlds, or I want to compete at Nationals, or maybe I want to win Worlds, or maybe I want to set a record, or whatever it is that they want to accomplish. And I say, okay, well, this training is going to get you there. Like, let's try and hit this at the end of this block. I think you can hit this. That's kind of what I'm projecting. Would you like to hit that? And like, I think specific numbers too can be really, really powerful. So like one of my girls right now, she's 123 pounds. And she's like 10 or 11 pounds away from pulling 400 pounds. She's like 11 pounds away from pulling 400 pounds, right? Yeah. Like 123. And so sometimes those numbers, like 4 plates, 315, 300, like those numbers can be really motivating when you're that close, or like a 500 pound deadlift for a lot of people. Yeah. Like those like big numbers can be really motivating. So I'm like, man, you're really, really close. I think you can hit your 400 pound deadlift at the end of this training cycle if you do this. Now that's in their head. And so I think utilizing those things, all sorts of little things, anything you can really use to motivate them, knowing the athlete, I think is really important. But that's kind of how I approach things.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, like you say, you go through that volume, strength, peaking kind of sequence and rotate through. Now, is that to some extent also the fact that if you think you spend too long in a hypertrophy block, you get too far from that real peak state of being able to display your maximal strength? Is that a factor in that decision making? So that, so rather than saying, we're going to have a whole 12-week hypertrophy block here, did you feel that you lose some ground there because then it takes a while to regain that skill of displaying the strength? Or is it just that, you found that psychologically, whatever, it's a factor there?
I'd probably say both. I think you definitely need to have exposure at doing lower rep ranges, because doing a set of 10 at an RPE 7 is very different than doing a set of 5 and a set of 3 at an RPE 7, right? And so I think that they do need exposure like that, especially if their long-term goal is that. I still think you can make some very, very good gains even doing a strength program in hypertrophy, just if you're dialing in your nutrition properly. I don't necessarily see a need to do 12 weeks of hypertrophy. I mean, I can see an argument being made for that. That's not necessarily how I approach it for that reason. And also, I also don't want to, again, there's kind of an opportunity cost in my mind, right? So let's say this volume block works really, really well. And I'm like, okay, let's do another volume block and another volume block. Well, then the next time we come back to that volume block, maybe it's not going to have the same response because we've kind of worn that out a little bit, right? Whereas if I did, let's say, volume strength and peaking or whatever, or hypertrophy strength peaking, I can do that for 2 or 3 years, probably about 2 years without changing a whole lot, still get a lot of good results. Whereas doing it this way, in my experience, I might only be able to get 4 months of really good training just from the volume block, then 4 months of really good training from strength. And I can only peak for 1 or 2 months. So, you know what I mean? So kind of that's just been my experience. I can see an argument being made for doing longer volume blocks, but that's just kind of how I tend to approach things and why I believe that's the case.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose the other thing is, of course, it's individual specific. So if you've got someone whose goal is, I want to hit this number at my next competition, versus someone who's like, I want to move up 2 weight classes, well, you're going to program perhaps differently there. The person who wants to move up a couple of weight classes might have a higher ratio of volume work or volume blocks, whether they be sequenced together or just in terms of the length relative to other blocks, because their end goal is that little bit different. So I suppose it's just one of those. Again, the answer is it depends. It's just great to kind of get your thinking and your thought process behind how you're doing things, because then I think for people listening, they can go, okay, that's cool, that resonates with me, and that makes sense for my goals, and then the listener can put that to use then.
Yeah, and I mean, if an athlete, for instance, wants to gain more muscle, and that's really a big priority for them, because they're shifting weight classes or something like that, then I mean, I might still just do that same block approach, but the strength block might have a whole lot more volume. Maybe I'm going to be doing, instead of 5 sets, I'll do 7 or 8 sets, right? It might just be a lot more voluminous. And so there's a lot of ways to tweak it, which again is the reason why, so everyone says you can't gain good muscle doing doubles and triples, and that's just nonsense. It's definitely not the most effective way, but I went from being 200 pounds or just under 200 pounds up to 260, 265, just doing doubles and triples. Never hypertrophy blocks. I never did any volume blocks. Again, I certainly don't recommend that, because in my opinion, there's much more effective approaches. However, I think that you can gain muscle even doing low repetitions if you dial in your diet and you have enough volume. And so, I don't necessarily think that volume blocks are the only time you're going to be building muscle. I've had athletes gain substantial amounts of muscle doing strength blocks, just because there's proper load management. Yes, and dietary interventions aligned as well.
Okay, there's 2 things I think that are really key there. The first one is, of course, again, everything's context and individual specific. Like you talked about, that a strength block could be a bit more voluminous. So, a strength block, a low volume strength block for one person is a high volume block for another in some respects, because
exactly.
There's those individual differences. So again, we're sort of making sure people don't view this as black and white. There's a spectrum, and there's shades of grey along the way. So I think that's important. And the other one that you mentioned a couple of times, is absolutely fundamental, is the nutrition side of things, because people often seem to be doing a hypertrophy block, but they're actually barely eating any surplus, or maybe even in a deficit, and they're wondering why they're not jacked yet. Well, it's like that training creates the potential for muscle gain, but your nutrition dictates if you reach that potential. And I think that's another crucial one. And it seems to me that you're quite in tune with how you maybe periodize your training, but also your nutrition needs to reflect that and work synergistically to get the best results.
No, 100%. I mean, I've had, I've done a volume block, and doing a volume block with high volume it can be pretty brutal. And I've seen athletes lose weight, and they're like, oh, I'm eating everything. And I'm like, you're not eating everything if you're losing weight. You need to eat more. And the bigger you get, the harder it can be to kind of force feed yourself. But that's the name of the game, you know? That's why not everyone does it, because sometimes it's not comfortable. But yeah, like those high volume blocks, you can really pack on substantial muscle. And I also think that there's, you know, I mean, there's obviously a pretty wide spectrum of intensities and rep ranges where you can build muscle. Even like the Schoenfeld study, like 30% to 85% 1RM, ranging from like 6 reps to 50 reps, right? So that's a pretty dramatic spectrum. So even on the lower end of the spectrum of hypertrophy, you're still recruiting those high threshold motor units, which you wouldn't necessarily get doing like 10 reps or 12 reps in your volume block. So you're still getting that hypertrophic response, but yeah, the nutrition definitely needs to be dialed in. Like all the time, you should be at least at a maintenance or in a slight surplus, in my opinion, for powerlifting, or else you're going to really struggle.
Yes, yeah. It's one of those, when you're in a surplus, almost it's like every week you can feel you get stronger, you can add some weight to the bar. Whereas if you're trying to do that in a deficit, like that's a real grind, and it gets old fast. And actually, you talked about enjoyment earlier on. You know, if there's no enjoyment there, then you know people are going to burn out and drop out of it. So they're probably better off, as you say, eating at a surplus or a maintenance, and then maybe if they get really, really elite and they need to dial it in to hit a certain weight class to be chasing, you know, titles or something, it's worth considering. But for the vast majority of people, just get as big and strong as possible.
No, totally. Yeah. If you're training in a deficit, you got to have it really, really dialed in. It's really technical, and it's going to happen super, super slow. Like I think the recommendations off of Helms et al. Was like, I can't remember what year he published the paper, but it was something like at a rate of weight loss of like 0.25% of your body weight, and at very most 0.5% of your body weight lost per week, probably leaning towards the lower end of that, which is like, nothing, you know, it's like nothing per week. It's so hard to measure even.
Exactly. I was going to say it's so small it's difficult to measure, because if you weigh yourself a little bit earlier or later, or you had a slightly bigger meal last night, or you ate a bit later than that before it can throw things off. So then you really need to be managing the data very closely and looking at rolling averages and all these sort of things. So yes, basically dieting when trying to get really, really strong, difficult. But you know, so we've taken up plenty of your time here. Don't want to take up too much more. So now we'll transition over just a quick fire round, some basically either or questions to learn a little bit more about you. So first up, pizza or burger?
Pizza.
Chocolate or peanut butter?
Definitely chocolate. Yeah.
Beach holiday or a city break?
I'd say city.
Okay. Steak, rare or well done?
Neither. I'll take medium.
Okay. The contrarian approach there. And eggs, scrambled or poached?
Poached.
Okay. Now, can you tell us something about you that people probably don't already know? This is the question that stumps most people.
Yeah. I trained at the Chinese National Center for Olympic weightlifting while I was living there, actually. Randomly, I met one of the Olympic weight, like I met the head strength coach for the speed skating team when they were in Canada, here in Calgary, training at the Olympic Oval. So I was training at the Oval. They were coming here for competitions, and I met the coach, and he was Dutch. His name is Dionisio Rosario or something like that. This is years ago, and I was born in Holland, and so he's like, oh my God, we're best friends now. And then he invited me to go to China and train with him. And I was like, why do I want to go to China? And then randomly enough, I found myself in China like not too long after. So I sent him an email, and then he gave me an invite to train, which was cool because normally there's like no foreigners allowed in there. So that was a really neat experience for sure.
Yeah. I bet that was a bit of an eye opener.
Yeah, it was cool. You see like a 10-year-old kid snatching like 80 kilos, and you're like, oh my God, I'm failing in life.
Yes, yeah, I was going to say, it'd be a humbling experience watching these 10-year-old kids warm up with your max or something.
Phenomenal athletes over there.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is, I have a contact book full of everyone in the world. Who should I interview next?
Oh man. I would really love to have an interview, I would love to watch an interview with either Andrei Milanichev or Kirill Saryuchev. Like, I think because of the language barrier sometimes, they don't really put out a whole lot of content, and I just find it really, really fascinating their training protocols and just learning a little bit more about their life. Although that's probably not applicable. So
yeah, my Russian's not up to much, but that's
yeah,
you'd have to get Mike Israel in to do the translation or something.
Yeah, geez. Maybe in that case, I'd say Chad Wesley Smith. I'm a huge fan of him, and he's an amazing athlete. So he's definitely someone I'd love to watch chat about some interesting powerlifting stuff.
Cool, excellent. All right, well we'll get the email invitation sent out and see if he's a taker. Okay, brilliant. So thank you so much for your time today, Daniel. Let's now give you the opportunity to let everyone know where they can learn a little bit more about you, the services you offer, anything you want to tell the listener. Send them in the great world of the internet.
Awesome. Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at Stacked Strength. So STACKED Strength. On Facebook, just Daniel DeBrocke. And my website is stackstrength.com. But I only coach a handful of athletes, and it's all through, it's all part of like a charity program that I run. So I've always wanted to sponsor athletes. And so all of the coaching that I do is free, which also means that I only take on a very, very small number of higher level athletes. I do have a couple of free programs and ebooks on nutrition on my website. They're free for download. Feel free to hit me up on Instagram. I'd love to ask or answer questions, things like that. But everything I do is free. I don't have any coaching products. I don't have any coaching programs as of yet, since I'm mostly just involved in the educational kind of arena. And so yeah, that's where you can find me. Hopefully you guys like some of the articles. I've got a lot of articles. Well, not a lot, but about 6 or 7 on breaking muscle and a couple other places as well. So yeah, man, it was awesome to be on here. I've been reading your guys' stuff for a long time, so it's pretty neat to be on the other end.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a pleasure having you on, and maybe we'll get you on another time to chat again and maybe go into some details. Perhaps even, assuming all goes smoothly, we can get one post your meet in March and review how the prep went.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to chat.
That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you heard and took value from it, please do me a favour by heading to iTunes right now, subscribing to the show and leaving a review. Positive reviews, like 5 stars, hint hint, really help the ranking of the show and will help us to spread the word and keep getting top class guests on. Make sure to follow Breaking Muscle on social media and me at Tom McCormick, that's TOMMACCORMICK on Instagram. Bye for now, and I'm looking forward to catching you on the next episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast.